Who told you to put this here? Chef Laurent Beaumont held the small glass jar between two fingers and stared at Annie Carter across the stainless steel prep table. Nobody, chef. I only thought Mr. Sterling might. Mr. Sterling came here to taste professional food, not something an 18-year-old kitchen helper cooked in her apartment. A few cooks nearby laughed. Laurent set the jar hard against the far corner of the table. Back to the mop bucket, Annie. Annie lowered her eyes. Yes, chef. Before she could reach for the bucket beside the service door, a man's voice came from behind Laurent. What's in the jar? The kitchen stopped. Arthur Sterling stood in the doorway. Only minutes earlier, the restaurant had been moving at full speed. The private dining room had been closed to ordinary guests for the afternoon. Long white tables were dressed with fresh flowers and polished silverware. Representatives from Sterling Hospitality Group sat beside the restaurant's owners and senior managers, while servers moved quietly between them. Arthur Sterling had come to Atlanta for one reason. His company was selecting a new dessert program for 28 luxury hotels. For Chef Laurent, the tasting could change his career. For Annie, it was supposed to be another shift. She wore the same black kitchen pants as everyone else, but her job was different. While the pastry cooks prepared chocolate shells and plated fruit, Annie carried crates, washed produce, wiped counters, emptied trash, and kept the floor clear. Laurent had made that distinction obvious all morning. Carter, stay away from pastry. Yes, chef. Carter, those plates are for service. Yes, chef. Carter, guests should not see utility staff near the dining room. Yes, chef. Annie never argued. She needed the job more than she needed the satisfaction of answering him. But she noticed things. She noticed the peach glaze was too sweet before the pastry cook added the final reduction. She noticed the panna cotta smelled more strongly of lavender than cream. She noticed the peaches themselves were excellent, but every dessert Laurent built around them seemed determined to hide their flavor. At one point, Annie had quietly said, Chef, maybe the glaze could use a little more lemon. Laurent turned slowly. Did I ask the girl peeling peaches for a culinary opinion? One cook looked away. Another smirked. Annie felt the sting but kept her voice level. No, chef. Then peel. She returned to the crate. Her own jar sat inside a brown paper bag beneath the prep counter. It was simple peach preserve with lemon thyme. No gold leaf. No expensive liquor. No imported vanilla. Just peaches, sugar, lemon juice, thyme, and salt. She had brought it because the tasting was happening 10 yards away. That was all. At least, that was what she kept telling herself. Around noon, Mateo Alvarez, the dishwasher working beside the prep sink, noticed the jar when Annie opened her bag. What's that? Nothing. Nothing usually doesn't come in a mason jar. Annie glanced toward Laurent. He'll fire me if he sees it. Mateo wiped his hands. Did you make it? Yes. Then why bring it? Annie hesitated. I thought maybe somebody might taste it. Somebody? She looked toward the dining room. Mateo understood. You mean Sterling. Forget it. Why? Because I'm 18, Mateo. I clean the walk-in and mop the service hall. Nobody out there came to hear what I think about dessert. Mateo looked at the jar. Maybe they should. Annie closed the bag. I'm not losing my job over jam. Before Mateo could answer, Laurent shouted from across the kitchen. Carter! Annie hurried over. Arthur had just rejected another dessert. Laurent's face was tight. What happened to the peach glaze? Annie looked at the plated tart. I don't know, chef. You said it needed acid this morning. I said maybe a little lemon would help. And now Mr. Sterling says he can't taste the peach. Annie said nothing. Laurent stepped closer. You think that makes you right? No, chef. You think one lucky observation makes you a pastry chef? No. Good. Because this kitchen already has one. He pointed at the floor near the service entrance. Mop it. Annie picked up the bucket. Behind Laurent, a server entered carrying another untouched dessert. Arthur Sterling had rejected the chocolate sphere, the lavender panna cotta, the poached pear, and now Laurent's peach tart. The server quietly repeated what Arthur had said. He said everything looks expensive, but nothing tastes alive. Laurent's jaw tightened. Annie turned toward the mop bucket. Her paper bag was still beneath the prep table. Then one of the younger cooks reached down to move it out of the way. The jar slipped free and rolled gently onto the stainless steel surface. Laurent saw it. What is that? Annie froze. My lunch bag, chef. I mean the jar. She walked toward him. It's peach preserve. You brought homemade food into my kitchen? It was sealed. That wasn't my question. I wasn't going to serve it. Laurent lifted the jar. The handwritten label looked almost childish beside the printed production labels covering the professional kitchen. Annie Peach. Lemon time. He read it aloud. Someone near the pastry station laughed. Laurent looked at Annie. You were planning to show this to Sterling? Annie didn't answer quickly enough. Laurent gave a short laugh. You actually thought a billionaire came here to taste jam made by the girl who scrubs the refrigerator shelves? A pastry cook muttered. Maybe she wants her own TV show. Another chuckle followed. Annie's face burned. Laurent held the jar toward them. Look at this. No commercial label. No approved kitchen log. No professional packaging. Then he looked back at her. What exactly did you think was going to happen? Annie forced herself to meet his eyes. I thought he might taste it. Laurent stared at her for a moment, almost amused by the answer. You don't understand how places like this work, Annie replied quietly. I understand more than you think. The laughter stopped. Laurent's expression changed. Excuse me? Annie knew immediately she had gone too far. I said I'm sorry, chef. No, that's not what you said. He placed the jar at the far edge of the prep table. Mr. Sterling is choosing food for 5-star hotels. He is not here to encourage some kid with a hobby. Annie's hands tightened around the mop handle. Laurent pointed toward the service corridor. Back to the mop bucket, Annie. Yes, chef. Then the kitchen door opened. Arthur Sterling stood there, looking past Laurent toward the small jar on the table. What's in the jar? Laurent turned. His voice changed instantly. Nothing important, Mr. Sterling. Arthur's eyes remained on the jar. It looks like jam. Yes, sir. Something one of the kitchen girls brought from home. Arthur stepped inside. Annie remained beside the mop bucket. Who made it? Laurent smiled politely. We have another plated dessert ready for you. Arthur did not move. I asked who made it. Annie raised her hand slightly. I did, sir. Arthur looked at her for the first time. Then he looked back at the jar. May I taste it? Laurent moved between Arthur and the prep table almost immediately. I strongly advise against that, Mr. Sterling. The kitchen went quiet again. Laurent placed one hand beside the jar. It was prepared off-site. It isn't part of our approved menu, and we have no sanitation record for it. Annie felt her stomach drop. Now the jar was no longer just something Laurent could mock. It could cost her the job. Arthur looked from Laurent to Annie, then back to the jar. What exactly is in it? Peaches, sugar, fresh lemon juice, lemon thyme, and a small amount of salt, Annie answered. That's everything in the jar, Mr. Sterling. There's no dairy, no nuts, no alcohol, and nothing artificial. Arthur Sterling studied her for a moment. And you made the entire batch yourself? Yes, sir. I made it at home 2 nights ago and kept it refrigerated after it cooled. Before Arthur could continue, Laurent stepped between them and placed one hand on the edge of the prep table. His tone was controlled now, far more careful than it had been when he was speaking to Annie. Mr. Sterling, the ingredients are not the main concern. This product was prepared outside a licensed commercial kitchen. We have no verified sanitation record, no temperature log, no production sheet, and no way of confirming how the jar was handled before it entered this building. I have a responsibility to protect the restaurant and every guest who eats here. Arthur nodded slowly. That is a legitimate concern, chef. Laurent's shoulders loosened slightly. Annie felt her stomach tighten. For a few seconds, she wished she had never brought the jar through the employee entrance. She could already imagine the conversation with human resources after service. She could imagine Laurent describing her as careless, insubordinate, and too immature to understand professional standards. If Annie's story moved you, please like this video and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. If you believe people deserve to be judged by their character and not their position, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. She reached toward the jar. I can take it home, Mr. Sterling. I never meant for it to become part of the official tasting. I only hoped someone might try it, if there was a safe way to do that. Laurent turned sharply toward her. You should have thought about that before bringing homemade food into my kitchen. Arthur looked at him. She has already admitted what she did. There is no reason to keep speaking to her as if she concealed it. Laurent's jaw tightened. I'm simply making sure the seriousness of the situation is understood. I understand it, Annie said. Her voice remained quiet, but she did not lower her eyes. I know this isn't a commercial product, chef. I never claimed that it was. Laurent stared at her, clearly displeased that she had answered at all. Arthur turned toward Vanessa Cole. who was standing near the kitchen entrance with a tablet against her chest. Sterling Hospitality brought a food safety coordinator for today's vendor evaluations, correct? Yes, Mr. Sterling. Dr. Bennett is in the demonstration kitchen. Would you ask her to come here? Laurent immediately objected. Sir, I don't believe we need to turn this into a formal review. The simplest solution is to remove the jar and continue with the approved tasting menu. Arthur gave him a calm look. I'm not asking the restaurant to approve it. I'm asking whether I can evaluate a small sample without pretending it has passed a process. It clearly has not. Vanessa left before Laurent could answer. The kitchen returned to motion, but only partly. Knives touched cutting boards. A mixer continued running at the pastry station. Servers moved through the doors carrying plates, yet everyone seemed aware of the jar sitting between Annie and Arthur. Laurent leaned closer to Annie. If anything happens to him after tasting that, you will be the first person everyone looks at. Annie met his eyes. I understand the risk, chef. That's why I'm not asking anyone to serve it. You brought it here. Yes, I did. I'm not denying that. Laurent seemed almost surprised by the steadiness in her answer. Arthur heard the exchange. Chef Laurent, I'm the one requesting the tasting. If I decide not to proceed after the safety review, that ends the matter. Until then, there's no need to frighten her into believing she poisoned someone before the lid has even been opened. Laurent straightened immediately. Of course, Mr. Sterling. I was only protecting the restaurant. A minute later, Vanessa returned with Dr. Karen Bennett, a woman in her 40s wearing a navy blazer over Chef White's. Arthur shook her hand. Thank you for coming over. We have a homemade peach preserve prepared off-site. It has not been served to guests. I'd like to know whether there is a responsible way for me to taste a small amount as an informed individual. Dr. Bennett looked toward Annie. You made it? Yes, ma'am. I cooked it Tuesday night, filled the jar while the preserve was hot, sealed it, let it cool, and then refrigerated it. Was the jar sterilized? I washed it first, then boiled the jar and lid before filling it. Do you know the finished pH? Annie shook her head. No, ma'am. I don't have the equipment to test that accurately at home. Laurent gave the smallest nod, as though the answer proved his entire case. Dr. Bennett continued. Then this cannot be considered a verified shelf, stable product, and it cannot be served to restaurant guests or represented as commercially approved. I understand, Annie said. I wasn't planning to put it on a plate for anyone, Arthur asked. If I understand all of that and still choose to taste a small sample for evaluation, is that something I can do? Dr. Bennett considered the question before answering. You can make that decision for yourself. I want everyone clear that I am not certifying the product. I am only confirming that it has not been served through the restaurant and that you understand its preparation history. That's clear. Laurent exhaled through his nose. Mr. Sterling, I still don't see why this is necessary. You have a full pastry department preparing food under professional controls. Arthur looked toward the plated desserts waiting near the service window. I've tasted the pastry department. The comment landed harder than if he had raised his voice. Arthur looked back at Annie. Did you use commercial pectin? No, sir. I tested it once while learning, but I didn't like how much it changed the texture and covered the peach flavor. I wanted the fruit to stay softer and more natural. Laurent folded his arms. Pectin is not some sign of poor cooking. It's widely used for consistency. I know that, Annie replied. I'm not saying it's wrong. It just wasn't right for the jar I wanted to make. Arthur's eyes stayed on her. That's an important difference. He turned toward Vanessa. Could I have a clean tasting spoon? Vanessa handed him a wrapped spoon from the service tray. Laurent stepped forward again. Mr. Sterling, with respect, I still advise against it. Arthur removed the wrapper. You've made your safety concerns clear, chef. Dr. Bennett has made the limits clear. I understand both. He opened the jar. The scent of ripe peach and lemon rose above the heavier smells of butter, sanitizer, and hot metal. Arthur tilted the jar slightly and looked at the preserve. The peach pieces had not dissolved into a smooth paste. They moved slowly through the amber syrup. He took less than a teaspoon. Annie's hands tightened against her apron. Arthur tasted it. He said nothing. Laurent waited several seconds, then began. As I was saying, homemade preserves can sometimes seem pleasant because they have a certain rustic. Arthur raised one hand without looking at him. Laurent stopped. Arthur swallowed and reached for another clean spoon. This time he took even less. He tasted again, more slowly. Then he looked directly at Annie. How much sugar did you use for the batch? Annie told him. His eyebrows lifted slightly. That's less than most preserve recipes would call for. The peaches were already very sweet. Adding more sugar would have covered them. And the lemon thyme? I added it near the end because if it cooks too long, it takes over. I wanted people to notice peach first and only pick up the thyme afterward. Arthur nodded. And the lemon juice? I adjusted it after tasting the fruit. I had a measurement to start with, but the peaches were sweeter than I expected, so I added a little more. Laurent interrupted. These are basic flavor principles, Mr. Sterling. Arthur turned toward him. Then why did your peach tart taste mostly like sugar and vanilla? No one nearby moved. Arthur placed the spoon on the tasting tray and looked at Annie again. This preserve is not perfect. Annie felt her chest tighten. Then he continued. But it is balanced. The peach still tastes like peach. The acid has a purpose. The thyme stays in the background, instead of announcing itself. Most importantly, nothing is trying to impress me. His eyes moved toward Laurent. This is the first thing I've tasted today that seems to understand the ingredient it was made from. Annie did not smile. She looked at Laurent instead. The expression on his face told her that Arthur's approval had not solved her problem. It had made her problem much more dangerous. Laurent's expression changed first. The anger did not disappear, but it moved behind a professional smile. Well, he said, looking toward Arthur instead of Annie. I'm glad you found something you enjoyed. Annie works in my kitchen, so naturally she's exposed to the standards we use here. Annie looked at him. Arthur noticed. You said she works in your kitchen, he replied. Did you teach her to make this preserve? Laurent adjusted the cuff of his chef coat. We've been developing peach preparations for this event for several weeks. She has been around those discussions. That wasn't what I asked. Laurent paused. Arthur pointed toward the jar. Did you teach her how to make that? Not that exact preparation. Did anyone on your pastry team? No, but then I'm not sure why you're taking credit for it. The kitchen became quieter without anyone being told to stop working. A mixer continued at the pastry station, and water ran into the dish sink. But no one nearby seemed willing to speak. Laurent's smile disappeared. I'm not taking credit, Mr. Sterling. I'm explaining that young employees learn by being around professionals. That is part of what a kitchen does. Arthur looked at Annie. How long have you worked here? 7 months, sir. What's your position? Kitchen utility assistant. Arthur glanced toward the mop bucket still standing near the service corridor. What does that include? Annie hesitated. Laurent was watching her now. I wash produce, clean equipment, help with deliveries, restock, take out trash, clean the walk-in, and do whatever prep I'm assigned. Do you work the pastry station? No, sir. Sauces? No. Dessert development? No. Laurent stepped in. She occasionally assists with basic prep when we're busy. Everyone contributes. Arthur's attention returned to him. So she learns your standards by cleaning your refrigerator shelves? A pastry cook lowered his head. Laurent stiffened. That's an unfair way to put it. Then put it fairly. For the first time, Laurent had no immediate answer. Annie wanted the conversation to end. Arthur's approval had felt good for less than a minute. Now every sentence seemed to push her further into a conflict she could not afford. Mr. Sterling, she said, I appreciate you trying it. Really. But Chef Laurent is right about one thing. I brought something into the kitchen that wasn't approved, and I shouldn't have done that. I can take it home and get back to work. Arthur studied her. You're worried about being fired. Annie did not answer. She didn't need to. Laurent did it for her. This is a professional kitchen, Mr. Sterling. Policies matter. If employees decide that enthusiasm excuses procedure, we have a larger problem. Arthur nodded. Policies do matter. Laurent seemed encouraged. Then I'm sure you understand why this will need to be documented. Annie's fingers tightened around the edge of her apron. Arthur looked at Laurent. You intend to discipline her? She brought an unauthorized homemade product into a controlled food service environment during one of the most important tastings this restaurant has hosted. I don't enjoy disciplining anyone, but I can't ignore it because the product happened to taste good. Dr. Bennett remained beside the prep table. From a food safety standpoint, Chef Laurent is correct that the jar should not have entered production space. Annie nodded. I understand. Dr. Bennett continued. But there is also a difference between bringing an item into the building and serving an unapproved product to guests. That distinction should be reflected in whatever report is made. Laurent gave her a restrained look. Of course. Arthur picked up the jar again. Annie, can you make this a second time? She looked at him. Yes, sir. The same way? I can make the same style. The exact balance depends on the peaches. That answer seemed to interest him more than a simple yes. What do you mean? If the fruit is sweeter, I use less sugar. If it's flatter, I adjust the lemon. I don't know exactly what I'll do until I taste what I'm working with. Arthur looked at Dr. Bennett. You said there's a certified demonstration kitchen being used for vendor evaluations. Yes, it's in the smaller ballroom next door. Is it operating today? It is. Laurent understood where the conversation was going. Mr. Sterling, surely you're not suggesting... Arthur ignored him. Could Annie prepare a fresh batch there using ingredients supplied and logged on site? Dr. Bennett considered it. If the kitchen is available, the ingredients come through approved inventory, and she follows the same sanitation requirements as any other vendor, then yes, it would be controlled preparation. Laurent shook his head. She is not a vendor. Arthur looked at him. She doesn't need to be. Sterling Hospitality rented that space for product evaluation. She is my employee. During her scheduled shift, yes. Laurent folded his arms. And I am not releasing her from her duties so she can play chef for an afternoon. Annie wished the floor would open beneath her. Arthur did not raise his voice. How much longer is she scheduled today? Laurent looked irritated by the question. Until 4. Arthur checked his watch. And when does her meal break end? Annie answered before Laurent could. In 6 minutes. Arthur nodded. Then I'm not asking you to release her now. He turned to Annie. When does your shift end? 4 o'clock. Do you have somewhere you must be immediately afterward? Annie thought of the bus, the grocery store, and her grandmother waiting at home. I need to be home this evening, but I have some time. Arthur set the jar down. Then after your shift, I'd like you to make another batch. Laurent gave a short laugh. Mr. Sterling, one decent spoonful doesn't make someone a professional cook. Arthur looked at him. I agree. That answer surprised everyone, including Annie. Arthur continued. One jar could be luck. A good batch on a good day with good fruit. So we test it properly. He looked at Annie. Same idea. New peaches, certified kitchen, no homemade ingredients, no shortcuts. Annie stared at him. And if it isn't as good? Then we learn the first jar was better. That's all? That's all. Laurent smiled again, but this time there was relief in it. Arthur noticed. Unless, he said, someone is afraid she can do it twice. The relief vanished. Annie looked from Arthur to Laurent, then toward the small jar that had caused more trouble in 20 minutes than she had caused in 7 months. She had spent the entire morning trying not to lose her job. Now the man who could change Laurent's career was asking her to stand in a professional kitchen and prove that Laurent had been wrong about her. Arthur waited. Annie took a slow breath. I'll do it. Laurent's eyes hardened. Arthur gave one nod. 4:15, demonstration kitchen. Then he turned back toward the dining room. Behind him, Laurent spoke quietly enough that only Annie could hear. You'd better hope that jar wasn't luck. Annie looked at him. For once, she did not say, yes, chef. I guess we're both going to find out. Laurent waited until Arthur disappeared through the dining room doors before turning toward Annie. You have 6 minutes left on your break, he said. Use them. Annie glanced at the jar. Can I put that back in my locker? No. She looked at him. Laurent picked it up and handed it to Vanessa. Keep it out of production space until she leaves. I don't want anyone claiming we contaminated the kitchen because somebody decided today was amateur hour. Vanessa accepted the jar without comment. Annie took a breath. Fine. Laurent's eyes narrowed. What did you say? I said fine, chef. That's better. He turned toward the prep station and raised his voice so the cooks nearby could hear him. Carter, after your break, finish the lower walk-in shelves, then the service corridor, the receiving floor, and the produce racks. If you somehow finish early, ask Matteo what needs scrubbing. One pastry cook glanced at the clock. There were less than 4 hours left in Annie's shift. The list was enough work for twice that. Annie understood the message. Laurent wanted her exhausted before 4:15. She said only, yes, chef. Matteo caught her near the dish station several minutes later. He's loading you up. I noticed. You want help with the produce racks? If he sees you doing my work, He'll make you redo the whole dish pit. Matteo looked toward Laurent. Wouldn't be the first stupid thing I did for somebody. Annie managed a small smile. I'll handle it. Matteo lowered his voice. You don't have to prove anything to him. I know. Doesn't sound like you know. She pushed a cart toward the walk-in. Arthur Sterling asked me to make the jam again. If I show up tired and ruin it, Laurent gets exactly what he wants. So slow down. I have a work list. I said slow down. I didn't say stop working. Annie looked at him. Matteo tapped the side of the cart. People make mistakes when they start doing 3 jobs at once because somebody wants them rattled. Finish one thing, then the next. Annie nodded. One thing at a time. That's the idea. Inside the walk-in refrigerator, cold air hit her face. Annie knelt beside the lowest shelf and began removing containers one row at a time. She checked labels, wiped spilled sauce from the steel, replaced everything in order, then moved to the next section. Laurent entered 10 minutes later. You're still in here? I'm almost finished. He ran one finger beneath the edge of a shelf and inspected it. You missed a spot. Annie looked where he pointed. There was barely a mark. I'll get it. Laurent remained standing over her. You should understand something before this afternoon. Annie kept wiping. What's that, chef? Sterling likes novelty. Rich men get bored. Sometimes they decide the dishwasher can paint, or the valet can sing, and everyone around them has to pretend they discovered a genius. Annie stopped moving. Laurent continued. Don't confuse his curiosity with respect. She stood slowly. I don't. Good. Because when this little performance is over, he goes back to his hotels. You come back here. Annie held the cloth in one hand. If I still have a job, that depends on what management decides. So the report is already happening. You violated procedure. I admitted that. That doesn't erase it. I didn't ask you to erase it. Laurent stared at her. Annie added, I just want the report to say what actually happened. His expression hardened. You're becoming very confident for someone who was mopping floors an hour ago. I'm still mopping floors. Then perhaps remember which job is paying you. He turned and left. Annie stood alone in the cold room for several seconds before returning to the shelf. She wanted to be angry. Anger would have been easier than fear. Her phone was in her locker, but she knew what waited there without checking it. A message from her grandmother asking when she would be home, a reminder about the electric bill, and a bank balance that did not care whether Arthur Sterling liked peach preserves. She finished the walk-in at 1:42. The service corridor took 30 minutes. Receiving took another 45 because a produce delivery arrived early, and Annie had to move boxes before she could clean beneath them. By 3, her shoulders ached. Laurent passed twice without speaking. The second time, he dropped a stack of greasy sheet pans beside the sink. Matteo's backed up. Matteo looked over. I'm fine. Laurent ignored him. Carter, help him. Annie checked the clock. She had 1 hour. Matteo waited until Laurent left. Don't touch them. He told me to help. You already cleaned receiving. Matteo, I can wash pans. So can I. He shook his head. You need hands that still work at 4:15. Annie pulled on gloves. I'm not going to stand around while you do my work. Matteo slid half the stack toward her. Fine. Half. That's fair. They worked without talking for several minutes. At 3:27, Vanessa appeared near the dish station. Annie. She turned off the sprayer. Yes, ma'am? Dr. Bennett wants you in the demonstration kitchen at 4. She needs to go over the sanitation procedure before you start. Annie glanced toward Laurent. Vanessa noticed. Your shift ends at 4. I already confirmed it with payroll. Chef Laurent gave me another cleaning list. Then do what you reasonably can until 4. Vanessa started to leave, then stopped. And Annie? Yes? I put your jar in the event refrigerator. Sealed, labeled, separate from restaurant inventory. Thank you. Vanessa nodded and walked away. Matteo smiled. Look at that. Your illegal jam got its own refrigerator shelf. Annie laughed despite herself. Don't call it illegal. At this point, that jar has better security than I do. The laugh helped more than Annie expected. At 3:55, she washed her hands, removed her stained apron, and cleaned the last counter she had been assigned. Laurent appeared beside the time clock. You leaving early? Annie looked up at the digital display. Send in Wushabafen. No, chef. Then you have 2 minutes. She picked up a sanitizer cloth and wiped the counter again. Neither of them spoke. At exactly 4, Annie clocked out. Laurent watched her remove her utility apron. You still have time to walk away from this. Annie folded the apron once and placed it on the shelf. I know. If you fail in there, Sterling won't remember your name tomorrow. Maybe. And everyone in this kitchen will. Annie looked at him. That sounds like something I'll have to live with. She started toward the ballroom corridor. Laurent called after her. Annie. She stopped. He pointed toward the mop bucket near the door. That will still be here tomorrow. Annie looked at the bucket, then back at him. So will I. At 4:15, she stepped into the certified demonstration kitchen. On the center table waited fresh Georgia peaches, lemons, sugar, lemon thyme, clean jars, a calibrated thermometer, and a blank production log. Arthur Sterling stood on the opposite side of the room. He nodded toward the ingredients. Nothing from home this time. Annie tied on a clean apron. No excuses either. Arthur's mouth lifted slightly. Good. Let's find out what you can do. Dr. Bennett stood beside the sink with a clipboard while Annie tied back her hair and washed her hands for the required time. The demonstration kitchen was smaller than the main restaurant kitchen but more controlled. Every ingredient had a printed label. Every container had a date. The thermometer had been calibrated that afternoon, and the clean utensils were still wrapped. Before you touch anything, Dr. Bennett said, we log the batch. Your name, the start time, ingredients, quantities, and any changes you make as you go. Annie picked up the pen. Even if I change the sugar halfway through? Especially then. Arthur stood several feet away with Vanessa and 2 members of his hospitality team. He had removed his jacket and folded it over the back of a chair. But he made no move toward the work table. This is your station, he told Annie. Nobody cooks for you. She nodded. Understood. And nobody rescues you. I wasn't expecting that either. Arthur gave a brief smile. Good. Annie wrote her name at the top of the production sheet. For a second, the sight of it felt strange. At the restaurant, her name usually appeared beside cleaning assignments, receiving lists, or closing duties. Here it sat beside the word product. The door opened. Laurent entered. Vanessa looked at him. Your service is still running. My Sue, chef can handle it. Laurent looked toward Arthur. If one of my employees is preparing food in a professional evaluation connected to this property, I should be present. Arthur did not object. Stand wherever Dr. Bennett tells you. Dr. Bennett pointed toward the observation side of the room, behind the marked line. Nobody crosses it without washing in and being logged. Laurent's mouth tightened, but he moved behind the line. Annie turned toward the ingredients. The peaches looked excellent at first glance. Large, fragrant, evenly colored. She picked one up, pressed gently near the stem, then set it down. She checked another. Laurent folded his arms. Are we waiting for the fruit to introduce itself? Annie ignored him. She selected 4 peaches, rejected 2, then chose 3 more. Arthur asked, why those? The softer ones will break down too quickly. Laurent interrupted. They're ripe. That's what ripe peaches do. Annie looked toward Arthur rather than Laurent. They're fine for slicing or puree. For preserves, I want some of the pieces to hold their shape. Arthur nodded. Keep going. Annie weighed the peaches before cutting them. Dr. Bennett recorded the amount. Annie peeled, pitted, and chopped them into pieces that were similar but not perfectly uniform. One of Arthur's executives, a woman named Claire Morgan, leaned slightly toward Vanessa. She's 18? Vanessa nodded. Annie heard it but kept working. She added the first measured amount of sugar and lemon juice, then mixed the fruit and let it sit. Laurent checked his watch. How long are we planning to watch peaches sit in a bowl? Annie answered without looking at him. Long enough for the sugar to start pulling out the juice. You don't need to wait. I do for the way I make it. Laurent laughed once. That sentence is doing a lot of work. Arthur turned toward him. Chef, you've already made your opinion clear. I'm trying to protect your time. I'll decide what wastes my time. Laurent said nothing after that. The fruit rested. Annie used the time to prepare the lemon thyme and sterilize the utensils Dr. Bennett had designated for the batch. She checked the saucepan twice before using it. Arthur noticed. Something wrong with the pan? No. I'm making sure the bottom is heavy enough. For what? so the sugar doesn't catch too quickly when the liquid reduces. Laurent shook his head. Any competent cook can control a saucepan. Annie finally looked at him. I'm sure they can. The answer was polite enough that he could not challenge it without sounding ridiculous. Matteo was not in the room, and Annie wished for 1 second that he were. Then she pushed the thought away. This was the exact situation he had warned her about. One thing at a time. She transferred the peaches to the pan and turned on the burner. Nothing dramatic happened. The sugar began dissolving. Juice gathered around the fruit. Steam rose gradually. Arthur watched her hands. You're not using the thermometer yet. I will when I need it. Dr. Bennett looked up from her clipboard but did not object. Arthur asked, So what are you watching now? The bubbles. Laurent gave another quiet laugh. Arthur ignored him. What about them? The water is still coming out of the fruit. When that changes, the bubbles get heavier and slower. You can tell that by looking? I can tell part of it by looking. And the rest? Taste, smell, texture. Arthur leaned against the counter behind him. That's not very scientific. Annie glanced toward Dr. Bennett. She has the science. Dr. Bennett smiled. I'm happy to be useful. Even Claire laughed at that. Laurent did not. After several minutes, Annie took a clean spoon, placed a small amount of syrup on it, waited, then tasted. She frowned. Arthur noticed immediately. What? Annie tasted again. The peaches are sweeter than the ones I used at home. Laurent shrugged. Fruit varies. That's basic kitchen knowledge. Annie nodded. He's right. The agreement seemed to surprise him. Arthur asked, What does that change? The sugar. You already added it. Not all of it. She pointed toward the measured bowl beside the stove. Almost a third remained. I hold some back until I know what the fruit is doing. Laurent stepped closer to the marked line. That isn't how production works. You can't build consistency by changing quantities every time you feel like it. Annie looked at him. I'm not changing it because I feel like it. Then what are you changing it for? Because the peaches changed. Arthur's eyes moved from Annie to the pan. Show me. She added only part of the remaining sugar, stirred, waited, then tasted again. After another minute, she added a little more lemon juice and wrote the adjustment on the production sheet herself. Claire walked closer to read it. You're documenting every change? Annie nodded. If I make it twice, I should know what I did differently. Laurent's face tightened again. That sentence had landed somewhere he did not like. Annie added the time later than Arthur expected. He asked why. If it stays in too long, you stop tasting peach. And if you add it too late, it sits on top of everything instead of becoming part of it. Arthur said nothing, but his attention sharpened. The mixture thickened. For the first time, Annie began to believe she might actually finish. Then she tasted it again. Her expression changed. She turned off the burner. Laurent almost smiled. What happened? Annie did not answer immediately. She tasted once more, then set the spoon down. The lemon is fighting the fruit. Arthur looked into the pan. Can you fix it? Maybe? Laurent spoke before she could continue. There it is. This is exactly the difference between home cooking and professional production. At home, you can keep adjusting until something works. In business, you need control. Annie stared at the pan. Nearly 40 minutes of work sat in front of her. Arthur asked, What are you going to do? She could try adding more peach. She could add sugar and bury the acid. She could keep moving until the numbers looked right even if the taste did not. Instead, she reached for the waste container. Laurent's smile appeared fully. You're throwing it out? Annie lifted the pan. Yes. You just wasted 40 minutes. She looked at him. I'd waste more by pretending it's good. Arthur straightened. Laurent's smile faded. Annie emptied the batch, washed the saucepan, and returned it to the station. Then she picked up another peach. Arthur checked the clock. You want to start over? Annie began weighing the fruit. I thought that was the point. For the first time since entering the room, Arthur looked satisfied before tasting anything at all. Annie started the second batch without looking at Laurent. She chose fewer peaches this time and spent longer checking each one before cutting. Dr. Bennett replaced the production sheet with a fresh page and wrote the new start time at the top. Same ingredients? She asked. Yes, but not the same amounts. Write down your starting point and every adjustment. Annie nodded. I will. Arthur remained near the observation counter. He had not checked his phone for several minutes, which Vanessa noticed before anyone else did. A man with 28 hotels waiting on decisions was giving an 18-year-old kitchen assistant more attention than he had given any dessert on Laurent's menu. Laurent noticed it too. "You could save everyone some time," he said. The first attempt already demonstrated the problem. A recipe that depends entirely on instinct can't be scaled. Annie continued cutting peaches. Arthur answered him. "She hasn't claimed it can be scaled. That is supposedly why we're here. We're here to see whether she can cook." Laurent looked toward the discarded batch. "She just threw away 40 minutes of work." Arthur nodded. "Because she thought it was wrong. In a commercial kitchen, waste matters. So does serving bad food." Laurent's jaw tightened. Annie transferred the peaches into a clean bowl and added less sugar than before. She waited until the fruit released enough juice to coat the bottom, then tasted a small piece. This time she adjusted the lemon before the pan reached the burner. Arthur noticed. "You already changed it. The last batch taught me where the problem started." "What was the problem?" "I treated these peaches like the ones I used at home. They're not the same." Laurent gave a tired sigh. "We've established that fruit varies." Annie turned toward him. "Knowing it varies and cooking like it varies aren't always the same thing." Claire Morgan looked down, hiding a smile. Laurent did not bother hiding his irritation. "You seem much more comfortable speaking now." Annie met his eyes for only a second. "I'm answering a question." Arthur stepped in before Laurent could respond, and she answered it. The burner came on. The room settled into a quieter rhythm. Annie stirred only when necessary. The fruit softened slowly, but the pieces held together better than in the first batch. When the bubbles changed, she lowered the heat without being told. Arthur watched. "You saw something. The syrup is reducing faster. Because? There's less liquid in these peaches. Are you sure?" "No." Arthur raised an eyebrow. Annie continued. "But I'm sure enough to lower the heat and check." That answer pleased him. She tasted the syrup, added only a portion of the remaining sugar, then waited again. Laurent checked his watch. "You'll never run a hotel program this way. You can't have employees standing over every pan waiting for the fruit to speak to them." Arthur looked at him. "How many people prepared your peach tart?" "4." "How many written specifications?" 16 pages across production and plating. "And I still couldn't taste the peach." Laurent's face hardened. Arthur turned back to Annie. "Keep going." Annie added the lemon thyme later this time and in a smaller amount. She stirred once, tasted, then added a pinch of salt. Claire leaned closer. "Why salt?" "It pulls the peach forward." "Does it make it salty?" "It shouldn't." Laurent laughed under his breath. "That's reassuring." Annie ignored him. After another 10 minutes, she spooned a small amount onto a chilled plate supplied by Dr. Bennett. She waited, pushed the edge with her finger, then shook her head. "Not ready." "How long?" Arthur asked. "I don't know yet." Laurent folded his arms. "Of course." Annie glanced at the clock, then back at the pan. "Maybe 2 minutes. I'll check before that." Arthur nodded. 90 seconds later, she tested again. The preserve moved more slowly across the plate. The syrup held a soft line when she pushed it, but it did not become stiff. Annie tested. For the first time since starting, her shoulders loosened. Arthur saw it. "That one?" "I think so." "You think?" She handed Dr. Bennett the production spoon and took a fresh one. Then she tasted again. "Yes, this one." Dr. Bennett checked the temperature and confirmed the handling procedure had been followed. She portioned a small tasting sample into a clean dish and placed it on the counter. Arthur did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he asked Annie, "What changed from the first batch?" "Less sugar at the beginning, more acid before the heat, lower temperature once the syrup started reducing, and less time." "Anything else?" "I stopped trying to make the peaches behave like the ones I used before." Arthur looked toward the sample. "That sounds simple." "It was harder than it sounds. Most useful things are." Laurent shifted his weight. Arthur picked up the clean tasting spoon and took a small amount. Annie watched his face, but he gave her almost nothing. He swallowed. Then he took another sample. Claire looked at him. "Well?" Arthur raised a hand. "Give me a second." He tasted again, paying attention to the finish. Finally, he set the spoon down. "It's better." Annie blinked. "Better than the jar I brought?" "Yes." She looked surprised rather than pleased. Arthur noticed. "You disagree? I thought the first jar was my best batch." "It probably was when you made it." "What does that mean?" "It means you adjusted." He pointed toward the production sheet. You didn't reproduce a memory. You responded to what was in front of you. Laurent stepped forward. That's basic professional cooking. Arthur looked at him. Then why have you spent the last hour explaining why she isn't a professional cook? Laurent went still. Annie looked down at the fresh preserve. Arthur continued. A recipe can tell someone how much sugar to add. It can tell them when to turn on a burner. It can tell them how many grams of acid to measure. What it cannot do is taste today's peaches. He turned toward Claire. That's what our development team keeps getting wrong. They're building consistency by forcing the ingredient into the formula. Claire nodded slowly. And she changed the formula. She changed the batch. Laurent stepped closer to the line on the floor. You're giving her too much credit for one correction. She works in a professional kitchen every day. Of course, she's absorbed some technique. Arthur looked at him. We've already had this conversation. I'm simply pointing out that none of this developed in isolation. Annie kept her hands on the edge of the work table. Laurent continued. Our team has been working with Georgia peaches for weeks. The glaze you tasted earlier uses the same principle she just demonstrated. Reduced sugar, stronger acid, late adjustment. Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly. The glaze you called your formulation? Yes. Annie looked up before she could stop herself. Arthur saw it. So did Laurent. His expression changed instantly. Arthur turned to Annie. What was that look? It was nothing. Laurent spoke quickly. She's tired. She's been working all day. Arthur did not take his eyes off Annie. Did you have something to do with that glaze? Annie hesitated. The room suddenly felt more dangerous than when the preserve had been boiling. Laurent's voice stayed calm. Be careful how you answer. Arthur turned toward him. No, chef. She should be accurate. Then he looked back at Annie. Did you contribute to that recipe? Annie swallowed. I suggested one change. What change? She looked toward Laurent and then back at Arthur. The lemon ratio. Laurent gave a dismissive laugh. She made a comment during prep. People make comments in kitchens every day. Arthur asked, was the recipe changed after she made it? Nobody answered immediately. Then a voice came from the doorway. Yes. Matteo stood there holding a thick black production binder. Laurent stared at him. Matteo lifted the binder slightly, and somebody wrote it down. Matteo walked into the demonstration kitchen and set the black production binder on the counter near Vanessa. Laurent's voice sharpened. Why did you bring that in here? Matteo looked at him. Because you said Annie only made a comment. I didn't ask you. No, chef. Mr. Sterling did. Arthur held out his hand. May I see it? Matteo passed the binder to him. Laurent stepped forward, but Dr. Bennett immediately pointed to the line on the floor. Please stay behind the marked area unless you wash in. He stopped. Arthur opened the binder. Inside were weeks of production sheets from the pastry department. Each page dated, initialed, and organized by batch. Matteo leaned over carefully and flipped to a page near the back. There, the sheet was labeled Peach Glaze Test Batch 4. Arthur read the printed measurements, then noticed handwriting in the margin. Reduce sugar 12%. Add fresh lemon after first cook. Taste before final reduction. Below the note were two initials. Che. Arthur looked at Annie. Yours? Yes. Laurent answered before she could say more. And if you keep reading, you'll see my signature at the bottom. I approved the final batch. Arthur looked down. Laurent's initials were indeed beside the approval line. Arthur closed the binder halfway. So Annie suggested the change. She suggested something. I evaluated it. Did the recipe change because of her suggestion? Laurent gave a tight smile. That is how kitchens work. Junior staff speak, senior staff decide. Nobody gets a medal every time they mention lemon juice. Annie kept her hands on the edge of the work table. Arthur looked at her. Were you asked to make that adjustment? No. Did you taste the glaze before you wrote this? Yes. Who gave you permission? Annie hesitated. Laurent almost smiled. She answered anyway. No one. I was cleaning the station, and one of the pastry cooks asked me what I thought because I said the peaches smelled too sweet. Which cook? A young man standing near the doorway raised his hand reluctantly. Me. Laurent turned. Evan Reed, one of the junior pastry cooks, shifted his weight. I asked her. That part's true. Laurent stared at him. You're paid to follow the pastry chef's direction, not run recipe development through utility staff. Evan looked uncomfortable. I wasn't running anything through her. I just asked what she tasted. Arthur turned to him. Did her suggestion get used? Yes. Laurent cut in. After I approved it. Arthur nodded. We understand that. Laurent folded his arms. Then I don't see the issue. The issue, Arthur said, is that 30 minutes ago you described the glaze as your original formulation. Now we have a dated record showing an important correction came from Annie. That still makes it my formulation. I am the executive chef. Arthur did not argue. He reopened the binder. Vanessa moved closer. Can I see that page? Arthur turned it toward her. She read the note twice. Annie, did you write on any other production sheets? Laurent's head turned toward her before Annie answered. I don't know. You don't know? I've made notes when someone asked me to taste something or when I saw a problem. I never kept track. Laurent gave a frustrated laugh. Because they were kitchen notes, Vanessa. This is being turned into something it isn't. Arthur looked at him. Then it should be easy to determine that. Laurent's face changed. Arthur continued. Nobody has accused you of anything. We have one production sheet and one employee confirming Annie made a suggestion that was used. That is not enough to draw a larger conclusion. Annie looked at him, relieved and disappointed at the same time. Arthur noticed. You don't want me deciding your value from one spoonful of jam. I'm not going to decide his character from one piece of paper either. Annie nodded. That's fair. Laurent gave a small shrug. Exactly. Arthur added. So we check. The shrug disappeared. Vanessa closed her tablet. I can pull the digital recipe revisions. Laurent looked at her. In the middle of service? I don't need the whole archive. I need the peach file. This is becoming disruptive. Arthur replied. So was being asked to consider a multi-property contract based on work I may not have been fully informed about. Laurent's voice cooled. You are implying dishonesty. No, I'm asking for attribution. That is a very serious distinction. I agree, which is why I'm being careful. For several seconds, Laurent said nothing. Then he looked at Annie. This is what you wanted? She blinked. What? A room full of executives going through my paperwork because you wanted attention. Annie straightened. I didn't bring the binder. You started this when you brought that jar. I brought jam. I didn't create the notes in your production book. The answer landed harder because she had not raised her voice. Laurent stepped closer to the line. You have no idea how much work goes into running a kitchen like mine. Annie looked at him. I know how much work goes into cleaning it. Evan looked down. Matteo did not. Laurent's jaw tightened. Arthur stepped between the conversation before it could turn into something else. Enough. Annie still has a batch on the table, and that is why we came in here. He looked toward Vanessa. Pull the peach revisions. Then to Matteo. Leave the binder. Matteo nodded. Arthur turned to Annie. You've done the hard part once. Can you finish this properly while other people look into the rest? Annie glanced toward the fresh preserve cooling beside Dr. Bennett. Yes. Good. Then cook. Don't investigate your own case while you're trying to work. Laurent gave a quiet scoff. Arthur ignored it. Vanessa and Matteo left with the binder. Evan returned to the main kitchen after Dr. Bennett reminded him he was still on the clock. The room narrowed again to the work table, the batch log, the peaches, and the people who had stayed behind. Annie took a clean spoon and checked the preserve. Arthur watched her. Too thick? No, still settling. Laurent stood behind the line with his arms folded. You know what happens if Vanessa finds nothing else. Annie placed the spoon down. Then she finds nothing else. And if that's all there is, then that's all there is. Laurent studied her, as if trying to decide whether she was pretending not to be afraid. She was afraid. She simply no longer wanted him choosing what she did with it. Dr. Bennett checked the batch log. 5 more minutes before the next texture test. Annie nodded. Arthur glanced toward the ballroom doors where Vanessa had disappeared. One production sheet could be explained. One suggestion could be dismissed. But if there were more, the afternoon was no longer about whether Annie could make jam twice. It was about how many times her work had entered Laurent's kitchen under someone else's name. 5 minutes later, Annie tested the preserve again. She drew a clean spoon through the batch, placed a small amount on the chilled plate, waited, then pushed the edge with one finger. Dr. Bennett watched. What do you see? It's holding without turning stiff. Arthur glanced at the plate. And that's what you wanted? Yes. If it sets too hard now, it'll be worse after it cools. Laurent remained behind the marked line, saying nothing. The silence did not make Annie more comfortable. She could feel him watching every movement. waiting for something to go wrong. Dr. Bennett checked the temperature and the batch sheet. Process is documented. You can fill the test jar. Annie lifted the sterilized jar with clean tongs and placed it on a folded towel. Her hands were steady until she reached for the ladle. Then she heard the ballroom door open. Vanessa returned carrying a printed stack of recipe revisions. Matteo followed several steps behind her. Laurent's eyes went immediately to the papers. Vanessa did not speak until she reached Arthur. I pulled the peach glaze files, the strawberry compote revisions, and the bourbon reduction notes from the last 4 months. Arthur looked at the stack. Why those 3? Because Annie's initials appear in all of them. The ladle stopped halfway between the pot and the jar. Annie looked up. Laurent moved closer to the line. That proves nothing. Staff initials appear everywhere in production records. Vanessa faced him. Not like this. She handed the first page to Arthur. The peach glaze adjustment we already saw was entered into the digital recipe the next morning. The change matches Annie's handwritten note almost exactly. Laurent answered quickly, because I approved it. Vanessa nodded. That's documented. Arthur looked at the next page. Vanessa continued. 3 weeks earlier, the strawberry compote recipe was changed from a full boil to a shorter cook, with part of the fruit added near the end. Arthur glanced at Annie. Did you suggest that? Annie searched her memory only long enough to answer the present question. I told Evan the strawberries were turning into sauce before service. Laurent interrupted. And I made the final call. Vanessa handed Arthur another page. The written note says, Annie suggests holding back 20% of fruit for texture. Laurent's face hardened. Arthur read the approval line. Again, Laurent had signed it. He looked toward Annie. Did anyone tell you your suggestion had been added to the official recipe? No, sir. Did anyone pay you for development work? No. Laurent laughed once, without humor. She is an hourly employee in a restaurant kitchen. Employees make suggestions. They don't receive royalty checks every time they improve something. Arthur kept his tone calm. Nobody said they should. Then what exactly are we discussing? We're discussing whether you knew she had useful culinary judgment while telling me she was only a utility worker who happened to absorb techniques from being near professionals. Laurent's mouth tightened. That is still what she is employed as. Arthur set the papers down. That may be the problem. Annie returned the ladle to the pot. Dr. Bennett noticed. Keep working. We can talk around you. Annie nodded and filled the jar carefully. She wiped the rim, set the lid, and recorded the time. Vanessa handed Arthur the bourbon reduction sheet. This one is different. Arthur read it. The original recipe had called for more brown sugar and a longer reduction. Beside the first trial, someone had written, too heavy after cooling. Cut sugar, reduce less. Finish with salt. The initials were AC. Arthur looked toward Annie again. You? Yes. Laurent stepped closer. That note came after she tasted a spoon someone left at the station. She was not assigned to develop anything. That's the 3rd time, Arthur said. The 3rd time what? The 3rd time she identified a problem that resulted in a documented recipe change. Laurent's voice rose slightly, and every one of those changes went through me. Arthur nodded. You keep saying that as if I'm arguing with it. Then stop implying I stole something. Arthur looked directly at him. I haven't used that word. You don't have to. Vanessa spoke before Arthur could answer. There's more. Laurent turned toward her. She held up another page. This is an internal email from Evan to the pastry team sent 6 weeks ago. The subject line is, Annie's acid fix. Annie closed her eyes for half a second. Laurent stared at Evan's name on the page. Vanessa read only the relevant line. It says the peach batch improved after Annie suggested adding fresh lemon after the first cook instead of before. Laurent shook his head. Evan is a junior pastry cook. He does not decide authorship. No, Arthur said. But he does establish that people in your kitchen knew where the idea came from. Laurent looked toward Annie. You've been keeping score this entire time? She turned from the jar. No. Then how convenient that everyone else suddenly has records ready for you. I didn't ask Matteo to bring the binder. I didn't ask Vanessa to search the files, and I didn't ask Evan to write that email. But you're enjoying this. Annie stared at him. For the first time that afternoon, something in her face changed. Not ennui, fatigue. You really think this is enjoyable? Laurent said nothing. She continued. I spent 7 months trying not to give you a reason to cut my hours. I cleaned what you told me to clean. I carried what you told me to carry. When you laughed at me, I kept working because I needed the paycheck. Nothing about standing here wondering whether I'll have a job tomorrow feels enjoyable. The room stayed quiet. Annie looked down at the filled jar. I didn't come here to take your job. I brought one jar because I wanted someone to taste something I made. Laurent's expression did not soften. Arthur did not interfere. Annie added, "You're the one who decided that was a threat." Vanessa lowered the papers slightly. Laurent took a breath. "You have no understanding of what it takes to run this operation," Annie answered more quietly. "Maybe not. But I understand what it feels like. When my ideas are good enough to use, and I'm still not good enough to stand near the stove." That landed differently. Arthur looked toward the production sheets, then back at Laurent. "What training opportunities has she been offered?" Laurent frowned. "What? 7 months here. Has she been cross-trained on pastry?" "No." "Sauce?" "No." "Prep cook track?" "She was hired as utility." Arthur glanced toward Vanessa. "Has she ever applied internally?" Vanessa checked her tablet. Annie looked surprised. After a moment, Vanessa said, "Twice." Laurent turned toward Annie. Arthur asked, "For what positions?" "Prep cook 1, 4 months ago. Pastry assistant, 6 weeks ago." "And the result?" Vanessa hesitated. Both denied. Arthur looked at Laurent. "Reason?" Vanessa read from the screen. "Not ready for culinary responsibility." No one spoke. On the table between them sat a fresh jar made in a certified kitchen under observation, beside 3 documented recipe improvements bearing Annie's initials. Arthur did not smile. He simply asked Laurent, "What exactly would she have needed to do for you to consider her ready?" Laurent opened his mouth. Nothing came out immediately. Dr. Bennett checked the clock and touched the jar lightly. "It needs time to cool before the final texture evaluation." Arthur nodded. "That's fine." Then he looked at Laurent again. "We have time." Laurent looked from Arthur to Vanessa, then toward Annie. She wasn't ready because technical judgment is only one part of professional cooking. Reliability matters, speed matters, discipline matters, understanding hierarchy matters. Arthur nodded. "Which of those did she fail?" Laurent's answer came quickly. "Experience. That wasn't on your list." "It should have been." Vanessa lowered her tablet. "The prep cook 1 position went to Caleb Morris." Laurent glanced at her. "Yes." "How long had he worked here?" Vanessa checked. 9 weeks. Annie already knew that. She had trained Caleb on receiving procedures during his first 3 shifts. Arthur asked, "Did he have previous restaurant experience?" 6 months at a casual dining chain. Laurent's irritation returned. "He had line experience." Annie spoke before she could stop herself. "He worked the fryer." Laurent turned sharply. "Nobody asked you." Arthur did not look away from him. "She's relevant to the conversation." Laurent exhaled. Caleb interviewed well. He carried himself like someone ready to move into the kitchen. Annie stared at him. The sentence hurt more than the earlier jokes. Arthur caught the change in her face. "What does that mean?" "It means confidence, professional presence, the ability to represent the kitchen." "And Annie doesn't have that?" Laurent hesitated. Annie answered for him. "He told me I was better suited to back-of-house support." Vanessa looked up. "When?" "After the pastry assistant interview." Laurent's voice hardened. "I gave you feedback. You told me guests expect a certain polish. That is not the same thing." Arthur's expression became still. "What kind of polish?" Laurent looked at him. "You know exactly what I mean. Communication, presentation, maturity." "She's 18, Arthur said. "Maturity can be taught." Laurent gave a small shrug. "Then perhaps she wasn't ready yet." Arthur glanced toward the cooling jar. "But her ideas were." Laurent did not answer. Annie wished Arthur would stop. Not because he was wrong, but because every question opened something she had spent months learning to swallow. She had told herself the denials were ordinary, that seniority mattered, that she needed more time, that being useful was better than being unemployed. Now the excuses sounded different when spoken aloud in front of people who were not required to accept them. Dr. Bennett checked the jar. "Another 10 minutes before I want anyone disturbing it." Arthur nodded. Laurent looked at the clock on the wall. "I have a dinner service to run." Vanessa said, "Your sous chef has already started the briefing." "I'm the executive chef." No one said otherwise. Laurent looked at Arthur. Is there anything else you need from me right now? Arthur leaned against the observation counter. I need an answer. To what? Why an employee whose corrections you approved repeatedly was denied even basic cross-training? Laurent's patience finally cracked. Because this is my kitchen. The words came out louder than anything he had said since entering the room. Nobody interrupted. Laurent continued, quieter but no less angry. I decide who advances. I decide who touches pastry, who works sauce, who stands in front of a guest. That is part of my responsibility. If I had to justify every staffing decision to every utility worker who thinks she deserves more, I would never get through service. Annie felt Vanessa watching her. Arthur asked, did she ever ask you to justify every decision? Laurent said nothing. Or did she apply for 2 jobs through the process your own restaurant created? She applied. And you rejected her? Yes. While using her corrections, I approved suggestions. Arthur nodded slowly. You keep hiding behind the word approved. I am not hiding behind anything. Then say it plainly. Was her judgment useful? Laurent looked at Annie. For the first time, she saw something in his face that had nothing to do with irritation. Calculation. If he said no, the paperwork contradicted him. If he said yes, the reasons for keeping her out of culinary positions became harder to explain. Finally, he said, occasionally. Matteo, still near the doorway, let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Laurent turned toward him. Something funny? No, chef. Then go back to work. Matteo looked toward Vanessa. She nodded. Go ahead. I'll call if we need you. Before leaving, Matteo met Annie's eyes for a moment. He did not smile or give her a speech. He simply tapped 2 fingers against the binder on the counter before walking out. The message was clear. The record was there. Annie did not have to shout. Dr. Bennett checked the jar again. We can test the set now. Everyone's attention shifted back to the preserve. Annie moved to the table and opened a second chilled plate. Dr. Bennett used a clean spoon to place a small amount on it. Your batch, she said. You evaluate it first. Annie waited several seconds, then pushed the preserve with the edge of the spoon. It wrinkled slightly and settled back without running. She tasted a small amount. The peach came first. The lemon lifted it without sharpening too much. The thyme stayed behind the fruit. She took another taste. Arthur watched her. Well, it's right. Laurent gave a quiet laugh. Convenient. Annie looked at him. You can taste it too. That seemed to catch him off guard. I don't need to. Why not? Because Mr. Sterling is the one evaluating it. Annie kept her voice steady. You've had a lot to say about whether I know what I'm doing. Taste it. Vanessa looked between them. Arthur said nothing. Laurent finally stepped toward the wash station. Dr. Bennett stopped him. Hands first, then a clean tasting spoon. He complied, clearly annoyed by every second of the process. When he returned, Annie slid the plate toward him. Laurent took a small amount. He tasted. His face changed almost imperceptibly. Annie saw it. So did Arthur. Laurent set the spoon down. It's competent. Arthur's mouth moved slightly. Competent? Yes. Better than the peach tart? Laurent looked at him. They're different preparations. That wasn't my question. Laurent remained silent. Arthur took a clean spoon and tasted the cooled preserve himself. He did not speak immediately. Then he looked at Annie. This batch is better than the one you brought in. Annie glanced at the jar, surprised despite herself. Arthur continued, you changed the sugar, the acid, the heat, and the timing because the fruit changed. That is not luck. Laurent folded his arms again. Arthur turned toward him. And now we have another question. Laurent's expression tightened. What question? Arthur tapped the stack of production records beside Vanessa. How many times did Annie have to prove she was useful before someone here decided she was worth teaching? Laurent looked at the production sheets as if the papers themselves had become an accusation. That question assumes I deliberately kept her from advancing, he said. Arthur remained beside the counter. Then correct the assumption. I assigned people where I believed they were strongest. And you believed Annie was strongest cleaning shelves? I believed she was reliable in utility. Annie heard the word reliable and almost laughed. Laurent had used it as praise when he needed her to cover an extra shift. Stay late, unload a delivery, or clean after someone else made a mistake. Now the same word sounded like a locked door. Vanessa tapped the screen of her tablet. There's something else we should look at. Laurent turned toward her. What now? The pastry assistant opening Annie applied for 6 weeks ago. We already discussed that. We discussed the rejection. I'm looking at the interview notes. Laurent's expression changed. Arthur noticed. Read them. Vanessa hesitated. These are internal management notes. The restaurant's general manager, Thomas Reed, had entered quietly a few minutes earlier after Vanessa asked him to join them. He was in his late 50s, still wearing the dark suit he used for executive events. Read the relevant section, Thomas said. Vanessa scrolled down. Candidate demonstrates strong attendance, kitchen awareness, attention to detail, and unusually good palate for current experience level. Annie stared at her. No one had ever told her that. Vanessa continued. Recommended for cross-training before reconsideration. Arthur looked toward Laurent. That sounds favorable. Laurent folded his arms. It also says she lacked station experience. Vanessa nodded. It does, Thomas asked. Was cross-training scheduled? No. Why? Laurent answered. We were understaffed in utility. Thomas's face tightened slightly, meaning you couldn't afford to move her. I needed dependable people where they were assigned. Arthur looked at Annie, then back at Laurent. So she was too valuable to move and not valuable enough to promote. Laurent exhaled. That is an unfair simplification. It's also what happened. Laurent turned toward Thomas. You understand staffing realities. People apply for positions they aren't ready for every day. Thomas did not defend him. I understand staffing realities very well. I also understand that if a manager blocks cross-training because replacing an employee in a lower-paid role is inconvenient, that manager is limiting the employee for the benefit of the operation. Laurent's voice became colder. Are we now pretending I built this entire staffing system myself? No, Thomas said. We're looking at your decisions inside it. Annie remained beside the demonstration table, unsure what to do with the fact that people were finally discussing choices that had shaped her working life, without ever asking how they felt from her side. Arthur turned to her. Did anyone explain why the cross-training never happened? No, sir. I was told the position had been filled. Did you ask again? Once. What were you told? Annie looked at Laurent. He knew the answer. She gave it anyway. Chef Laurent said I should focus on becoming excellent at the job I already had. Thomas looked down. Arthur asked, and what did you do? I went back to work. Laurent shook his head. Which was good advice. There is nothing degrading about utility work. Annie met his eyes. I never said there was. Then stop acting as if I insulted you by expecting you to do it. I'm not ashamed of the work. Her voice stayed level. I'm asking why the work became a reason I couldn't learn anything else. Laurent opened his mouth, but Thomas spoke first. That's a fair question. The room grew quieter. Dr. Bennett began clearing the used tasting utensils from the station, giving the conversation space without leaving. Vanessa scrolled again. I found another item. Laurent gave a tired laugh. Of course you did. Vanessa ignored the remark. This is a scheduling email from 3 weeks ago. Evan requested Annie for 2 hours of pastry prep because they were short a person. Arthur looked toward her. Was she approved? Vanessa read the reply. Chef Laurent denied the request and wrote, Keep Carter on utility. I don't want staff confusing competence with advancement. Annie felt something go cold inside her. Thomas looked directly at Laurent. Did you write that? Laurent did not answer immediately. It appears that I did. Arthur repeated the sentence slowly. Confusing competence with advancement. Laurent rubbed one hand across his jaw. It was poorly phrased. Thomas said, It was also a management instruction. I was protecting structure. Arthur looked at him. From what? From employees assuming that because they perform one task well, they are entitled to the next position. Annie finally spoke. I never asked to skip anything. Laurent looked at her. I asked to be trained. That requires time and resources. So did teaching Caleb. Laurent's face hardened again. Arthur caught it. Who trained Caleb? Laurent said nothing. Vanessa checked the staffing record. Evan and Chef Marisol. Arthur looked at Annie. And Annie? No cross-training hours recorded. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, then turned toward Laurent. Did you ever intend to give her any? Laurent's patience broke. This is absurd. You are taking normal staffing decisions and turning them into some moral trial because a billionaire liked a jar of jam. Arthur's expression did not change. No, chef. The jam is why I noticed her. Your paperwork is why we're still talking. Laurent pointed toward Annie. She is 18 years old. She has no culinary degree, no professional certification, and less than a year in a serious kitchen. I did not owe her a promotion. Annie answered before anyone else could. You're right. Laurent stopped. She continued. You didn't owe me a promotion. You didn't owe me praise. You didn't even owe me a place on pastry. She looked at the stack of records. But if you used my ideas, you could have said they were mine. If your own interview notes said I should be trained, you could have given me a chance to learn. That wouldn't have cost you your title. Laurent stared at her. Annie's voice softened. It would only have meant there was room for somebody else to grow. Thomas looked toward Vanessa. Send me copies of everything we've reviewed. The applications, interview notes, recipe revisions, and that scheduling email. Laurent turned sharply. For what purpose? Thomas answered without raising his voice. For an internal review. The words landed harder than shouting would have. Laurent looked at Arthur. This is because of him. Thomas shook his head. No. He asked questions. Our own records supplied the answers. Arthur stepped toward the demonstration table and rested one hand beside Annie's finished jar. The product still needs a final evaluation, he said. The employment issue belongs to your management team. Laurent gave him a bitter look. Convenient separation. No, Arthur replied. Necessary separation. Her jam should stand on its own. So should your conduct. He reached for a clean spoon. Annie watched him open the cooled jar. For the first time that day, two judgments were happening at once. One concerned what Annie could make when someone finally let her stand at the stove. The other concerned what Laurent had done while making sure she rarely got near one. Arthur did not taste the preserve immediately. He turned toward Dr. Bennett instead. Is the sample ready for a formal evaluation? Dr. Bennett checked the batch sheet one more time. For tasting in this controlled setting, yes. Everything used in this batch was logged. The equipment was sanitized, and the preparation steps are documented. I am not certifying it as a commercial shelf-stable product, but the sample itself was handled properly. Arthur nodded. That's all I needed. Claire Morgan joined him at the tasting table. Vanessa remained near Thomas, while Laurent stood several feet away with his arms folded. Arthur opened the jar and placed a spoonful into 3 clean tasting dishes. One for me, one for Claire, one for Vanessa. Laurent gave a small laugh. We're doing a panel now? Arthur looked at him. We're evaluating food. That usually involves tasting it. Claire tried hers first. She waited before speaking. The peach is clear. Vanessa tasted next. The time is lighter than I expected. Annie nodded. It should be. Arthur took his sample last. Nobody watched Annie anymore. They watched him. He tasted once, then placed the spoon down. The batch is good. Laurent let out a breath through his nose. Good. Then perhaps we can finally return to the actual purpose of today's event. Arthur looked at him. We are still discussing the actual purpose. The purpose was selecting a dessert program for Sterling Properties, and food quality is part of that decision. Laurent gestured toward Annie's jar. A homemade style preserve is not a hotel dessert program. No one said it was. Then what exactly has this afternoon accomplished? Arthur answered without hesitation. It showed me your kitchen contains talent you apparently weren't using very well. Laurent's face tightened. Thomas stepped forward. Arthur, before this goes any further, I want to be clear that we'll handle our employee review internally. I expect you to, and Annie's original policy violation still has to be addressed. Annie looked at him. Thomas continued, bringing outside food into a controlled kitchen was not appropriate. That doesn't disappear because the product turned out well. I understand, sir. Laurent seized on the point. Then she should receive the same disciplinary action any other employee would receive. Thomas looked at him. If the policy calls for a written warning, she'll receive one. It may justify more than that. Based on what? Insubordination, disruption, failure to follow chain of command. Annie stared at him. Thomas's expression changed. Be specific. Laurent pointed toward her. She challenged my authority in front of staff. Participated in a private product demonstration without management approval, and allowed confidential kitchen records to be used in a dispute against her supervisor. Matteo was no longer in the room, but Vanessa reacted immediately. She didn't bring the records. Laurent ignored her. She encouraged this entire situation. Annie finally spoke. How? Laurent turned toward her. Excuse me? You said I encouraged it. Tell me what I did. You brought the jar. I already admitted that. You contradicted me in front of Mr. Sterling. When? Laurent paused. Annie continued, still calm. When he asked who made the jam, I told him I did. When he asked whether I suggested the lemon adjustment, I told him I did. When he asked if I applied for training, I told him I did. Which answer was I supposed to change? Laurent's face hardened. You're 18 years old. You think because people are listening to you today, you suddenly understand how a professional kitchen operates. No. I think people asked me questions and I answered them. You knew exactly what you were doing. Annie's voice dropped slightly. I was scared I'd lose my job before Mr. Sterling even opened the jar. That stopped the room for a moment. She looked toward Thomas. I still don't know if I'm going to lose it. Thomas answered directly. You are not being terminated tonight. Laurent turned. Thomas. I said tonight. Thomas continued. Annie will receive whatever standard corrective action applies to bringing outside food into a restricted production area. The rest is under review. Laurent stared at him. And I'm expected to continue supervising her after she's accused me of taking credit for her work? Annie shook her head. I never used those words. Arthur added. I did not hear her accuse you of theft either. Vanessa held up the printed records. The documents raised the issue. Laurent's voice sharpened. Documents do not run kitchens. People do. Arthur nodded. That may be the first thing you've said today that I completely agree with. Laurent looked at him. Arthur continued. Which is why how those people are treated matters. Thomas stepped between them before the argument could grow. Enough. Laurent, you need to return to dinner service. Vanessa and I will finish reviewing the records tonight. Laurent did not move. Thomas's voice became firmer. That was not a suggestion. Laurent looked toward Annie. You're coming in for your shift tomorrow. It sounded more like a warning than a question. Annie nodded. I'm scheduled at 6. Then be there at 6. I will. He turned and left the demonstration kitchen. The door closed behind him. Only then did Annie realize how tightly she had been holding her shoulders. Vanessa gathered the records. I'll need a written statement from you before you leave. Annie looked at the clock. How long will that take? 20 minutes if we keep it simple. My grandmother is expecting me. Call her. We'll make sure you get out of here. Annie nodded and reached for her phone. Arthur watched her move toward the corner of the room, then looked at Thomas. You said she'll be back under Laurent tomorrow. For now. Is that wise? Thomas rubbed one hand across his forehead. I can't suspend an executive chef based on a few documents before I review the full record. Arthur nodded. That's fair. Thomas looked surprised. Arthur added, but retaliation is easier to prevent than explain afterward. I know. Across the room, Annie spoke quietly into her phone. I'm fine, Grandma. I'm just going to be later than I thought. She listened. No, I didn't get fired. Another pause. Not yet. Vanessa heard the last two words and looked down. When Annie ended the call, Arthur approached her. You told your grandmother you might be fired? I told her I wasn't fired yet. That sounds different. It feels different when you have rent due. Arthur considered that. Then he pointed toward the finished jar. Take that one home. Annie looked surprised. I thought you wanted it. I wanted to know whether you could make another one. And? You can. He slid the jar toward her. The next question is harder. Annie looked at him. What question? Arthur picked up the production sheet containing every adjustment she had made. Whether you can turn what you do by instinct into something another kitchen can reproduce without losing what makes it good. Annie looked at the sheet. That sounds like a lot more than making jam. It is. Arthur placed the page beside the jar. And tomorrow, once the employment issue is separated from the food, I want to see how you solve it. Annie stared at him. Tomorrow morning she would still report to Laurent at 6. Tomorrow afternoon Arthur Sterling wanted her back at a development table. For the first time all day, the two parts of her life were no longer separated by a kitchen door, and Annie had no idea which one would reach her first. At 5:57 the next morning, Annie stood outside the employee entrance with a paper cup of coffee and the finished jar from the demonstration kitchen tucked inside her bag. She had slept badly. But she arrived 3 minutes early because she refused to give Laurent one easy reason to say she was unreliable. When she entered the kitchen, the normal morning noise was already building. Produce boxes lined the receiving wall. Coffee brewed near the service station. Someone was portioning butter while another cook called out refrigerator temperatures. Laurent stood beside the prep board. He looked at Annie, then at the clock. Carter, good morning, chef. You're on produce until 9. After that, storage shelves and receiving. Yes, chef. Nothing in his tone referred to the previous afternoon. That made Annie more uneasy than anger would have. She put on her apron and started with the peach delivery. 20 minutes later, Evan approached with an empty container. Need anything? I'm Fina. He lowered his voice. I heard management was here late. Annie kept sorting fruit. I don't know anything about it. Laurent barely spoke during closing. Then maybe everybody got more work done. Evan smiled, but it disappeared when Laurent looked in their direction. Read, pastry. Evan left immediately. Laurent walked over. You're not discussing management matters with staff. I wasn't. You were talking to Evan. We were talking about work. Laurent leaned closer. Yesterday does not change the chain of command. Annie placed a peach into the approved crate. I know. Do you? Yes, chef. You're still the executive chef, and I'm still scheduled on utility. He studied her, perhaps searching for sarcasm. There was none. Good. He started to walk away, then stopped. And your meeting with Sterling today does not happen during my shift. Annie looked up. Mr. Sterling said he wanted to continue the product work after the employment issue was separated from the food. He can want whatever he likes. Until you clock out, you work here. That's what I plan to do. Laurent stared at her another second before leaving. At 8:30, Thomas Reed entered the kitchen with Vanessa. Laurent saw them immediately. Office? Thomas asked. Laurent wiped his hands. I have prep. Your sous chef can cover 10 minutes. This time Laurent did not argue. They disappeared into the small management office near receiving. Annie kept working. She did not ask what was happening. She did not move closer to the door. She did not need another accusation that she was trying to turn the kitchen against him. At 9:15, Vanessa approached her station. Annie, Thomas wants you to know the review is continuing. You're not expected to discuss it with anyone during service. I haven't. I know. Annie waited. Vanessa added, and there will be no change to your hours while it's being reviewed. The relief Annie felt was immediate enough to embarrass her. Thank you. That isn't a favor. It's procedure. I still appreciate knowing. Vanessa nodded. Your Sterling session is scheduled for 4:15 again. Off the clock. Annie looked toward Laurent. He knows, Vanessa said. Is he okay with it? That wasn't the question we asked him. Annie almost smiled. By 4 o'clock, her back hurt from lifting crates and scrubbing shelves, but Laurent had not found a reason to send her home or write her up beyond the food policy incident. She clocked out and walked to the demonstration kitchen. Arthur was already there with Claire Morgan and Dr. Bennett. On the table were 3 trays of Georgia peaches, each marked with a number instead of a supplier name. No jar waited for her. No finished recipe either. Arthur pointed toward the trays. Yesterday you proved you can make a good batch. Annie set down her bag. You said today would be harder. It is. He handed her 3 small tasting plates, each holding a slice from one of the peach lots. Same variety, same growing region, different harvest dates. Annie tasted the first, then the second. The third made her stop. Arthur asked, what changed? Number 2 is sweeter. Number 3 has more acid, but the texture is softer. Claire wrote something on her clipboard. Arthur nodded toward the blank production form. Yesterday you adjusted by instinct. Today I want you to explain your instinct before you cook. Annie frowned. I'm not sure I can. Then start with what you know. She looked at the 3 trays. If I use the same sugar for all 3, they won't taste the same. Good. The second needs less sugar. How much less? Annie hesitated. Arthur waited. Maybe 10%. Maybe? She looked at him. You told me to explain what I know. I know it needs less. I won't know exactly how much until it starts cooking. Arthur nodded. Write that down. She did. For the 3rd batch she wrote, reduce cook time. Add lemon later. Watch texture closely. Claire looked over the sheet. You're creating decision points. Annie glanced at her. I guess. Arthur corrected her. You are. The exercise changed the way Annie worked. Instead of simply reacting to the pan, she had to stop and describe why she was reacting. When the second peach lot began releasing more juice than she expected, she wrote it down. When she held back sugar, she recorded the amount. When she delayed the time, Dr. Bennett marked the time. Halfway through, Arthur asked. If you weren't standing here, how would another cook know when to make that change? Annie stared at the bubbling pan. They wouldn't. That's the problem. She thought for a moment. Then she took a spoonful of syrup, let it cool, and placed it beside the production sheet. Could we describe what it should look like at this stage? Claire moved closer. Annie continued. Not just temperature. Bubble size. How fast the syrup runs off the spoon. How much the fruit has softened. Arthur's expression changed. Now you're developing a process. For the next 40 minutes, Annie turned things she had always judged with her senses into instructions another person could follow. Not perfectly, but clearly enough to test. When the batch neared completion, she placed a spoonful on a chilled plate. The preserve spread too quickly. Laurent's voice came unexpectedly from the doorway. Undercooked. Everyone turned. He stood outside the marked line. Thomas was beside him. Annie looked back at the plate. Laurent added, if you're building a repeatable process, you just missed your finish point. Annie checked the pan, then the clock. No. Laurent gave a thin smile. No? It needs another 90 seconds. Arthur did not speak. Neither did Thomas. Annie restarted the timer. Laurent watched the clock. 30 seconds. 60. At 90, Annie cut the heat and took another sample. She waited, then pushed the preserve with the spoon. This time it held a soft line without turning firm. Dr. Bennett checked the temperature and recorded it. Annie looked at Laurent. Now it's finished. Arthur tasted the cooled sample. Then Claire did. Arthur set down the spoon. Write 90 seconds into the test notes. Annie picked up the pen. Laurent remained at the doorway. Arthur looked toward him. She didn't memorize that. Laurent said nothing. Arthur continued. She understood what changed and knew what the batch needed. Thomas glanced at the production sheet, then at the records in the folder under his arm. That may matter for more than the jam. Laurent's face tightened. Arthur looked at Annie. Tomorrow, we test whether another cook can reproduce your instructions. Annie stared at the pages covered in her handwriting. Yesterday, she had been trying to prove she deserved to stand at a stove. Now someone else was going to cook from directions carrying her name. The next afternoon, Annie stood on the opposite side of the demonstration kitchen and watched someone else make her preserve. That felt stranger than cooking it herself. Claire Morgan had selected Megan Price, a pastry cook from another Sterling property who had never met Annie and had not tasted any of the previous batches. Megan received only the written process Annie had developed the day before. No verbal coaching, no corrections from across the table. Arthur had insisted on that. If the instructions only work when Annie is standing beside them, he said, then we don't have a process. We have Annie. Megan read the first page twice. Hold back 20% of the sugar until after the first taste? Arthur nodded toward Annie. Don't ask her. Follow what's written. Megan smiled. Right. Sorry. Annie kept her hands folded in front of her. Laurent stood behind the observation line again. Thomas and Vanessa were beside him. The folder Thomas carried was thicker now. Annie noticed it but forced herself to keep watching the stove. Megan selected peaches, weighed them, added the starting sugar, and followed the first temperature mark. The process worked. Not perfectly. At the first decision point, Megan hesitated over Annie's note. If peaches taste flat after first cook, adjust lemon in small amounts before adding remaining sugar. She tasted. Then she added a measured amount of lemon juice. Annie felt the urge to say, too much. She stayed quiet. Arthur noticed her expression. You disagree? I'm not supposed to help. You're not. I'm asking what you see. Annie kept her voice low. She added more than I would have. Megan heard her and looked up. Arthur raised one hand. Keep going. Megan continued. The preserve reached the final stage. She followed Annie's description of bubble size, syrup movement, and fruit texture instead of relying only on the timer. When the chilled plate test was ready, Megan examined it. Needs another minute. Annie looked at the plate. Arthur asked, what do you think? Maybe 45 seconds. Megan laughed. Now I'm nervous. You shouldn't be, Annie said. It's your batch. Megan waited 50 seconds, tested again, and stopped the cook. Dr. Bennett checked the temperature and recorded the result. After the sample cooled, Arthur tasted it first. Then Claire. Then Annie. The preserve was sharper than Annie's batch, but the peach still came through clearly. Arthur asked Megan, could you make this again using those instructions? Yes. Without Annie? Megan looked at the pages. I'd probably make small changes based on the fruit, but the decision points are clear enough that I'd know what I was changing and why. Arthur nodded. That's what I wanted. Laurent spoke from the observation side. So now we're calling a basic preserve procedure product development? Arthur turned toward him. No, we're calling a repeatable process product development. Laurent gave a tired smile. You've spent 3 days turning ordinary kitchen judgment into something extraordinary because you liked the story. Annie felt herself tighten. Arthur did not. What story? The young kitchen helper nobody noticed. The difficult executive chef. The billionaire who discovers hidden talent. It makes everyone feel good. Arthur looked at him for several seconds. You think that's why I'm here? I think you decided what this meant before management finished its review. Thomas stepped forward. That review is finished enough for us to discuss the first findings. Laurent's smile disappeared. Thomas set the folder on the counter outside the marked line. We reviewed Annie's 2 internal applications, the cross-training recommendation, scheduling records, recipe development notes, departmental emails, and statements from 6 employees. Laurent folded his arms. And? Thomas opened the folder. The issue is not that you failed to promote Annie. Management is allowed to choose the strongest candidate. Laurent nodded once. The issue is that after her interview recommended cross-training, you denied every request that would have provided it. I needed her in utility. We know. That is a staffing decision. By itself, yes. Thomas turned a page. But during the same period, at least 4 culinary adjustments attributed to Annie were incorporated into active recipes. Laurent looked at Arthur. This again, Thomas continued. In 2 cases, employees were instructed not to include her name in the final development notes because, according to one witness, you said utility staff were not part of the creative team. Annie looked at Vanessa. Vanessa did not look away. Laurent's face hardened. Who said that? Thomas closed the folder. The identity of employees cooperating with the review is not something I'm discussing in this room. Laurent laughed once. So anonymous complaints now outrank the executive chef. No. Documents, multiple statements, and your own emails are being evaluated together. Laurent looked toward Annie. You've done well for yourself. Annie felt the insult beneath the words. I didn't write your emails. You knew what this would become. I didn't even know the interview notes existed until Vanessa read them. Arthur stepped closer. Chef Laurent, stop trying to make an 18-year-old employee responsible for your records. Laurent turned on him. You have no idea what it takes to run that kitchen every day. Arthur nodded. You've said that several times. Because it's true. Then show me something. Laurent frowned. Arthur pointed toward the remaining peaches. You keep saying Annie's work is basic. You say everything she did came from exposure to your kitchen. Fine. He pulled a clean production sheet from the clipboard and placed it on the table. Make the preserve. Laurent stared at him. You cannot be serious. Completely. I am an executive chef. I don't need to prove I can cook jam. Arthur glanced at Annie. Neither did she. Laurent's jaw tightened. Arthur continued. You demanded that she prove one good jar wasn't luck. You questioned her sanitation, her experience, her judgment, her professionalism. She answered every question. Laurent said nothing. Arthur moved the peaches slightly closer to the marked line. Now I'm asking one. Laurent looked at Thomas. This is ridiculous. Thomas did not rescue him. It's optional. Laurent laughed. Of course it is. Annie finally spoke. You don't have to make it. He turned toward her. She continued. I'm not asking you to. Something in that answer bothered him more than a challenge would have. You think I can't? I think you don't want to. Laurent stepped forward. Dr. Bennett pointed toward the sink. If you're entering the production side, chef, wash in first. For several seconds he did not move. Then Laurent removed his watch, placed it on the counter, washed his hands, tied on a clean apron, and crossed the marked line. He picked up one of the peaches. Fine. Arthur stepped back. No assistance from Annie. Laurent gave her a hard look. I won't need any. Annie moved to the observation side. For the first time since she had entered that restaurant 7 months earlier, Laurent stood at the stove while Annie watched. And this time, he was the one being evaluated. Laurent worked quickly. Too quickly, Annie thought. He selected the first peaches that met his eye, weighed them, cut them evenly, and added sugar without tasting the fruit first. His movements were practiced and efficient. Nobody watching could reasonably say he did not know how to cook. That almost made the difference more obvious. Arthur stood beside Claire while Dr. Bennett recorded the batch. "You're using the same ingredients Annie used?" "Yes," Laurent replied. "Peaches, sugar, lemon juice, thyme, salt. There's nothing mysterious about it." Annie stayed on the observation side of the room and kept her mouth closed. Laurent brought the fruit to heat faster than she had. He measured everything once and followed the numbers without changing them. After several minutes, Arthur asked, "Have you tasted the peaches?" Laurent kept stirring. "I know the product." "That wasn't my question." Laurent picked up a clean spoon and tasted the syrup. "It's fine." Annie looked down. Arthur noticed. "You disagree?" "She's not supposed to assist me," Laurent said. "I asked her, not you." Annie hesitated. "The fruit is sweeter than yesterday." Laurent gave her a look. "And? I would hold back some sugar." "You would?" "Yes." Laurent continued cooking. When he added the thyme, Annie could smell immediately that he had used too much. It rose above the peach before the preserve had even finished. Claire noticed as well. "That herb is much stronger." Laurent answered, "It will settle." Arthur said nothing. The batch reached the chilled plate test. Laurent checked it once, decided it was ready, and cut the heat. Dr. Bennett documented the final temperature. After the sample cooled enough to taste, she prepared clean spoons. Arthur tried it first. His expression did not change. Claire tasted next. Then Thomas. Laurent folded his arms. "Well?" Arthur took another small spoonful before answering. "It's technically sound." Laurent's shoulders eased. Arthur continued, "It's also too sweet, and I taste thyme before I taste peach." Laurent's face tightened. "That is subjective." "Of course it is. We're tasting food," Claire added. "The texture is consistent, but Annie's batch had more fruit character." Laurent looked toward her. "You're comparing two styles." Arthur shook his head. "We used the same ingredients because you said her work was basic. I said the principles were basic. And yet she handled the fruit better." Laurent looked at Annie. She did not smile. That seemed to irritate him more. "You think this proves you're better than me?" Annie shook her head. "No." "Then what exactly do you think it proves?" "That I know how to make this preserve." The answer was so simple that Laurent had nothing useful to attack. Thomas closed the folder in front of him. "We're done here." Laurent turned. "Done with what?" "The product comparison. The staffing review. This conversation." Something in Thomas's tone changed the room. Laurent removed the apron. "So what happens now?" Thomas looked at Vanessa, then back at him. "Effective immediately. You are being removed from service pending a formal management review." Laurent stared at him. "You're suspending me." "Yes." "Over recipe notes from an 18-year-old utility employee?" "No." "Over a pattern documented across staffing decisions, training denials, attribution records, and your own written instructions." Laurent laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "This is absurd." Thomas continued. "You'll be paid according to company policy while the review is conducted. Human Resources will contact you tomorrow. You are not to change schedules, contact employees about their statements, or access the development files until the review is complete." Laurent looked toward Arthur. "This is what you wanted." Arthur answered calmly. "I wanted to know whether I could trust the leadership behind a contract carrying my company's name." "So you destroy my career because you liked her jam?" Arthur shook his head. "No. Your own records created this problem." Laurent stepped closer. "You have no idea what I've built here." Thomas moved between them. "That's enough." Laurent looked toward Annie one last time. For a second, she expected anger, blame, maybe another insult. Instead, he said, "You'll learn that kitchens are not fair." Annie held his gaze. "Maybe that's why people should stop making them worse." No one applauded. No one needed to. Laurent picked up his watch, removed his chef coat, and handed it to Thomas before leaving through the service corridor. The door closed. Annie released a breath she had been holding without realizing it. Matteo appeared at the entrance a few minutes later after Vanessa sent word that the review meeting had ended. He looked around. "Where's Chef?" Vanessa answered. "Gone for the day." Matteo studied Annie's face. "Thought you'd look happier." Annie sat on the edge of a chair. "I wanted him to stop treating me like I didn't belong anywhere except behind a mop." He stopped. "Because he got suspended." Matteo shrugged. "Those things are related." Annie looked toward the empty doorway. I didn't want to ruin him. Matteo leaned against the counter. Stopping somebody isn't the same as destroying them. She said nothing. He continued, justice isn't fair because the right person finally gets hurt. It's fair when the wrong thing stops happening to the next person. Annie looked at him. That sounds rehearsed. It sounded better in my head. She laughed for the first time that afternoon. Vanessa waited until Matteo left before approaching Annie. There's something I need to say. Annie stood. Vanessa looked down at her tablet before switching it off. I watched Laurent talk down to you more than once. I told myself it was kitchen hierarchy. Executive chefs are demanding. Young employees have to prove themselves. Those were easy explanations. Annie listened. Vanessa continued. They were also convenient. You didn't make his decisions. No, but I helped create the environment where nobody questioned them. Annie looked toward the production sheets on the counter. What happens now? We review everything properly, not just your case. What does that mean? Training records, promotion patterns, credit on recipe development, who gets opportunities, and who doesn't. Annie nodded. Vanessa added, I'm sorry I didn't look sooner. Annie thought before answering. Then look sooner next time. Vanessa gave a small nod. I will. Arthur had remained quiet through the exchange. Now he picked up Annie's production sheet and placed it beside the cooled jar. There's one more thing. Annie looked at him. About Laurent? No. Arthur tapped the page. About you. She straightened slightly. Arthur continued. Sterling Hospitality will not sign the restaurant contract today. Thomas nodded. He had expected that, but that decision has nothing to do with whether I'm interested in this product. Annie looked at the jar. You still are? I'm more interested than I was yesterday. She frowned. After all this? Especially after all this. Arthur slid the production sheet toward her. Tomorrow we talk about work. Real work. Pay. Training. Food safety. Ownership. And what happens if we decide this preserve belongs in more than one kitchen? Annie stared at him. Arthur picked up his jacket. And before you ask, no. I'm not offering charity. He looked toward the jar. I'm offering you a chance to be paid for what you can actually do. For the first time since Laurent had told her to go back to the mop bucket, Annie did not feel the need to defend where she belonged. Tomorrow, she would find out what Arthur Sterling believed her work was worth. The next afternoon, Annie sat across from Arthur Sterling, in a small conference room beside the demonstration kitchen. No chefs were present. No tasting plates waited between them. For once, nobody was asking her to prove what she could do. Arthur placed a blue folder on the table. Before we talk about the jam, I want to talk about you. Annie glanced at the folder. That sounds more serious than jam. It is. Claire Morgan sat beside Arthur with a legal pad. And Vanessa had joined them only to represent the restaurant while Annie's employment situation was still being reviewed. Arthur opened the folder. How much are you paid now? Annie told him. And your official title? Kitchen Utility Assistant. Arthur nodded. Do you receive health insurance? No, sir. Paid culinary training? No. Transportation assistance? No. Arthur closed the folder halfway. Then here is what Sterling Hospitality is prepared to offer. Annie straightened. A full-time paid culinary development fellowship, 12 months to start. You would rotate through pastry, product development, and hospitality research kitchens. You would receive health insurance, paid training, a transportation allowance, and a formal review at the end of the year. For several seconds, Annie said nothing. Arthur waited. Finally, she asked, doing what exactly? Learning how professional food development works while continuing to cook. You mean school? Partly, but you'll be paid while you learn. Annie looked at Claire. And I'd actually be allowed to work on products? Claire smiled. That would be the point. Annie looked back at Arthur. I'm 18. Yes, I don't have a culinary degree. I know. I haven't even worked a year in a professional kitchen. I know that too. She narrowed her eyes slightly. Then why are you offering me this? Arthur leaned back. Because I watched you cook. Annie waited. You made a mistake and threw out the batch instead of hiding it. You adjusted to the fruit instead of forcing the fruit into a recipe. You documented what you changed. Then you turned instinct into instructions another cook could follow. He paused. That is teachable talent attached to good judgment. I can build on that. Annie looked down at the folder. What about my job here? Vanessa answered. You're still employed while the internal review continues. If you accept Sterling's offer, we'll coordinate your departure properly. You won't be treated as if you walked out." Annie nodded slowly. Arthur opened a second section of the folder. "Now the jam." She looked up. "This part is different. I am not offering to buy your home recipe for a few $1,000s and put my company's name on it." Annie's expression changed. Arthur noticed. That happens too often. Someone with more money decides ownership is the same thing as contribution. Claire slid a one-page summary toward Annie. If the preserve moves forward, Sterling Hospitality would fund development in stages. Annie read the first line. "Up to $1 million? Potentially," Arthur said. "Not tomorrow. Not as a check handed to you for one jar." He pointed to the milestones: commercial, kitchen testing, process review, shelf life testing, pH validation, nutrition labeling, packaging, consumer trials, production scaling, distribution testing. Annie looked at him. "So the $1 million is for building the product?" "Exactly. And if it fails, then we stop at whatever stage proves it isn't commercially viable." She appreciated the answer more than a promise. Claire continued, "You would keep development credit and participate contractually in the product if it reaches market. Nothing would move forward without an agreement that clearly states what belongs to you and what Sterling is funding." Annie looked at the page again. "My name stays on it?" Arthur answered immediately. "If we build it, yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "What about the jar I brought in?" "That jar stays yours." Arthur leaned forward. "I tasted something worth investigating. That is not the same as saying it's ready for a grocery shelf." Annie smiled faintly. "Dr. Bennett would probably chase us out of the building if we tried." Dr. Bennett would be correct. Arthur pushed the folder closer. "The jar was enough to get my attention. You were enough to keep it." Annie looked at the signature line. Her hand did not move. Arthur noticed. "What are you worried about?" "My grandmother. Her opinion?" "That too." She gave a small smile. "But mostly the schedule. She has appointments. Some weeks I need to get home early." Arthur nodded. "We can build that into the fellowship schedule." "You can?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because people have lives." The simplicity of the answer caught her off guard. Arthur continued. "There will still be deadlines. You will still have responsibilities. But a job should not require you to pretend family stops existing when you clock in." Annie looked down again. For months she had planned every day around buses, shifts, bills, and whatever Laurent might decide she deserved. This felt different because nobody was asking her to be grateful for being allowed into the room. They were discussing terms. "Can I take this home before I sign?" Arthur smiled. "I'd be disappointed if you didn't." 8 months later, Annie stood inside a certified production kitchen in Georgia wearing a clean white chef coat with her name stitched above the pocket. Annie Carter. She was 19 now. On the table in front of her sat the final commercial batch of Georgia Peach Preserve. The label read, "Annie Carter's Georgia Peach Preserve, made with Georgia-grown peaches." Arthur arrived just before the final tasting. Annie handed him a clean spoon. "Food safety approved this time." Arthur took it. "Good beginning." He tasted the preserve, waited, then took a second small sample. Annie folded her arms. "Well?" Arthur set the spoon down. "Ship it." That evening, Annie carried a case of the first production jars into the apartment she still shared with her grandmother. She placed one on the kitchen table. Her grandmother picked it up and studied the label. "They spelled your name right?" "I checked 3 times. The older woman opened the jar, spread a little preserve onto toast, and took a bite. Annie waited. "Well?" Her grandmother chewed thoughtfully. "Needs less sugar." Annie stared at her. "Seriously?" Her grandmother took another bite. "I didn't say stop making it." Annie laughed and reached for the jar. 8 months earlier, some of the most powerful people in the room had looked at Annie Carter and seen an 18-year-old girl carrying a homemade jar where it did not belong. Chef Laurent had been right about one thing. That jar did not belong on his menu. It belonged to Annie. The story reminds us that talent, dignity, and intelligence are not determined by age, race, job title, or social status. Annie was treated as if her place in the kitchen defined her worth. Yet her patience, honesty, and skill eventually spoke louder than prejudice. True justice did not come from humiliating the person who looked down on her, but from giving credit where it belonged and creating a fair opportunity for her to grow. The lesson is simple. Never underestimate someone because of the work they do today. Because the person standing quietly in the background may be carrying an ability that has never been given a chance to be seen. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.